Today, we explore the last of the 5 students, bhikkhus, one time, long time ago, at the time of Kassapa Buddha's dispensation, when it was ending, where we had a group of 7 bhikkhus go up at the top of a cliff without going back over the same details, which we've covered already at least 3 times in 3 sutta exploration classes. So today happens to be the last of the remaining 5. The first, if you recall, of these bhikkhus became an arahant. 5 days into it, when they pushed away the ladder that was connecting this huge boulder to the rest of society, so they had isolated themselves. And the second one became an Anāgami. At the end of his life, he reappeared in the Suddhavasa realm, the pure abodes, where Brahma gods, specifically Anāgamis, can only be reborn into. And the rest of the 5 died because they starved to death. And they ended up just being reborn in different deva realms during that long eon, until their paramis, their perfections, brought them to the time of the dispensation of Lord Buddha, our current dispensation of Lord Buddha Gautama. And we saw how Dabba Mallikaputta, he was the youngest to attain arahantship at 7. And then we saw Bahya Daruchirya, Bahya of the bark cloth, and how he grasped so quickly the Buddha's instruction, and he attained instantaneously in hearing the verses. And then we also saw Venerable Pukkusati, who used to be a king in that very last lifetime of his. And he had come all the way down to Rajaka to meet Lord Buddha. And Lord Buddha came all the way from Savatthi, over 340 some miles, to see his student who he had never met. I mean, Pukkusati had never met his teacher, Lord Buddha. We saw how lovingly he explained to him the Dhatu Vibhanga Sutta, the elements, where Venerable Pukkusati also became Anāgami and 3rd stage. And then he died. And then we saw last time, in last class, we saw Venerable Kumara Kassapa. And in the Vammika Sutta, the anthill, or the termite mound. And we saw the riddles that the Brahman, Anāgami, Devata, the god, had posited for him these questions. So today we come to the last of this group, specifically Venerable Sabhiya. So, as you know, I like to go ahead and see whatever I can share with you as far as the background story goes. So, to me, it's very interesting to get a better feel, if you will, of the person to be that we'll be studying and the sutta that we'll be exploring, which comes to us from the Sutta Nipāta, which is one of the earliest, if not the earliest, collection of suttas that was the collection itself very familiar to the bhikkhus and bhikkhunis. So oftentimes we find references to the suttas that today also we find in nowhere else other than the Sutta Nipāta. So that's where we find Sabhiya Sutta from the Mahavagga, or the great section of the Sutta Nipāta. And again, Sutta Nipāta falls in the Kuddaka Nikāya, which is the minor collection. Even though they say it's the minor, but it's pretty vast. You have the Dhammapada, you have the Theragata, you have the Therigata, to name a few. And the Jatakas later, and a bunch of other things also got added. Milinda Panya, for example. So who is Sabhiya? Well, his mother came from a nobility, and of that time period. However, her parents had made a vow to, in a way, give her off, hand her over to a class of teachers. And in those days, these were called the Paribhajikas, or the wandering ascetics. What these individuals did were they explored different philosophical ideas, and they enjoyed debating a lot, but they were also very curious to know. So they weren't just like argumentative people who just went from one place to the next to argue to see who's going to win. However, we know that usually turns into arguments and rhetoric, and it's all a matter of ego and conceit. So without deviating too much, so the parents gave her to this teacher whom they respected. He was one of the teachers at the time of the Paribhajikas, and unfortunately he took advantage of her, and seduced her and got her pregnant, basically. Eventually, she was seen to be carrying a child, so they saw that she was pregnant, and sadly they just dragged her out of the group and kicked her out of that group, because obviously it reflected badly on their teacher. So she had to bear the pregnancy on her own, unattended, uncared for, and eventually they say she had the child, who came to be known as Sabhiya, out in the open. And some places you might see that he was born Sabhiya in a hall, in one of those halls where these Paribhajikas would gather to debate. So that's what Sabhiya means. It means also a hall, open space. And they used to be big spaces, because you would have different Paribhajikas and other recluses would come, sometimes all the way down from the Himalayas, for them to exchange ideas, if you will, and to interrogate each other on the subtleties of existence, ontological issues, etc., questions on being, etc. So in time, Sabhiya becomes very well known in his own right, because he also becomes a Paribhajika, and he pursues going from teacher to teacher, while also being guided by his mother, who, by the way, really excels in the jhanic practices. And eventually she dies, and she reappears in the Brahma realms. It doesn't say if she attained Anāgamin stage, but the commentaries I saw where she was mentioned they say she reappeared in the Brahma realms. So she was using the Brahma Viharas, etc. So, meanwhile, the Paribhajika Sabhiya, the wandering ascetic Sabhiya, was going from one part of India to the next. India would be called, to this day, in some texts we see India being called Jambudvipa or Jambudvipa, and that is India. And they say how he was well known throughout India for his expertise in analysis, in asking questions, in formulating ideas, etc. So philosophically, he was very augmented, and he became a very well-known dialectician. So to the point where they had constructed a hermitage for him, where he would also teach not just wandering ascetics, but also the Khattiya Kumara, they call them. And these were, Khattiya means the warrior class. So Kumara means the princes. So the warrior class princes would go to him so that they could do, if you will, intensive courses in philosophy and different disciplines, literature, etc. So he was very well disciplined when it came to knowledge of those days. So it was during that time, perhaps he was also was having one of those moments that we have seen with Bahya, the Aruchirya, where he was thinking, wow, look at me. You know, I'm surrounded by all these people who are bowing down to me saying, Guruji, Guru, 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 Guru. So I must be it. I must be that good. I must have really made it. So I must have reached the holy life's goal. So perhaps that was what was going through his mind when guess who appears again? The same Suddhavasa, Anāgamin Brahmā God. The same one who appeared with the other companions of the holy life, whom he had known at that time period during Lord Kassapa Buddha's dispensation. So the Suddhavasa Brahma God says to him, hey, there is now a Buddha who has appeared in the world. So now is the time for you to go ahead and seek him out. But he doesn't give him too many details, and asks him a few questions. Now, there's 3 different versions of this. One version of commentators say, in one of them, they give the version where the Suddhavasa God is asking the riddles or the questions, about 20 questions, and urges him to go and seek out whoever is able to answer these questions. And if this person, this teacher, whom he finds is able to answer satisfactorily, then Sabhiya should become immediately that teacher's student without missing any more opportunities. So this is one version. The other version says Sabhiya himself, over the course of his years of teaching and studying, he had formulated these questions himself. These were questions that he didn't find himself to suitably having reached a conclusive definition or understanding of. And then there's the third version. The third version says that Sabhiya's own mother had formulated these questions, and she gave it to him prior to her death, and those were the questions that he was after. So, but the tendency is that it's the first version, because it also coincides with the pattern that we've seen with the other four, especially the three that we've covered together here, Pukusati, Bahya, and Kumara Kassapa, how the Brahma god came in and gave them this instruction, in a sense, to urge them to go towards the Buddha. So, but without going further into it, we'll cover as they need to when they come up. So this is from the Kuddaka Nikāya, the minor collection, in the Sutta Nipāta, in the Mahavagga section, Sutta Nipāta number 3.6, Sabhiya Sutta. So let's begin. Again, it starts with Venerable Ananda's statement. I have personally heard this. At one time, the Blessed One was living in the squirrel's sanctuary in the bamboo park in the royal city of Rajagha. It was during that time that a certain Deva appeared in front of Sabhiya, the wandering ascetic. The Deva, who during an earlier lifetime was a former companion of Sabhiya in the holy life, posed a riddle to him by adding the following instruction. Sabhiya, you must go and lead the holy life under that teacher who happens to be the only one capable of answering this riddle. Then the wandering ascetic Sabhiya, having learned the riddle given to him by the Deva, went from one recluse to another, Brahmin after Brahmin, meeting them in gatherings large and small, to the respective teachers presiding over these assemblies and gatherings, to his contemporary and famous founders of the prominent sects at that time, as he spoke with those who were recognized and accepted as wise by many. These included Purana Kassapa, Makkali Gosala, Ajita Kesa Kambali, Pakudha Kachayana, Sanjaya Bellati Putta, and Nigantanata Putta. These were the prominent figures of India, Indian spiritual traditions of that time, and to this day, some of them, like Nigantanata Putta, he happens to be the Tirthankara, or of the Jain religion, the last Tirthankara, and he's also known by Mahavir. And we have these individuals coming up in various different suttas. You see them in the Digha Nikāya, Majjhima Nikāya, in this case, Sutta Nipāta. And they had their own philosophical schools and huge followings. In particular, you have the last one, Nigantanata Putta, who was who had considered himself to be the arch enemy of Lord Buddha, by the way. And we see how he and his followers used to devise one plan, covert operation, if you will, after another, to cause a major scene or embarrassing situation about Lord Buddha or his students, to discredit him. And we see them again and again in various different suttas. We also will see one in one of the suttas that we'll cover in the Pāli Sutta. And Sanjaya is the same one that we encounter with Venerable Sariputta and Mahamoggallana. He was their teacher at one point. And he also happens to be Paribhajaka. So you have this group that were the best of the best, if you will, of Indian philosophical schools at that time in that part of the Indian subcontinent. So he goes to each of these and posits his questions. However, when Sabhiya, the wandering ascetic, would approach and ask them the riddle, They not only were unable to answer the question, but would openly express anger towards him and often were annoyed by his questions. In addition, they would engage in arguments with him while cross-questioning and debating with Sabhiya over the riddle for which he sought an answer. Then it occurred to Sabhiya, these recluses and Brahmins, whether in large or small gatherings, the respective teachers presiding over these assemblies and gatherings, my contemporaries and famous founders of these prominent sects, such as Purana Kassapa, Makkali Gosala, Ajita Kesakambali, Pakudha Kachayana, Sanjaya Belathiputta, and Nigantanataputta. When questioned about this riddle, they have not been able to give me an answer, and as a result, openly expressed anger towards me, and often are annoyed by my questions. Not only that, but they also engage in arguments with me, while cross-questioning and debating with me over the riddle, for which I seek an answer. Then, being alone and discouraged thus, Sabhiya reflected to himself by considering, why don't I just give up this holy life and return back to living the lowly life of pursuing sensual enjoyments? Simply because Sabhiya was born to his mother, who happened to be at one point a follower of the Paribhajakas, does not mean that he automatically was to be a recluse at birth. He had relinquished being a layman, and he had made the decision to become a wandering ascetic later in life when he became an adult. So that's what he's referring to, going back. And it is, compared to the lay life compared to living the spiritual or holy life is always looked down upon. And that's why we see the word lowly or substandard to the holy life, if you will. Now, this does not mean necessarily that because of the person shaving their head or putting on, donning robes is automatically living the spiritual life. We need to be careful about that, because many lay people who are devout practitioners might in fact be living the spiritual life. So we need to be cognizant of that subtle but very important difference. But when we look at how he got suddenly discouraged, well, he was in his 20s, mid-20s perhaps, and when you yourself have these questions and you've been urged to go and find the person whom you will call a teacher, and because he could not find anybody who was of his level, and he had gone to the best of the best, to his knowledge, because these were all elders to him. These were all elders compared to him, to Lord Buddha. So this is happening at Lord Buddha's earliest days of his dispensation. This is like really when Lord Buddha's Nibbana is quite relatively early on in his career as a Buddha, if you will. So it's very fresh, not to demean in any way the meaning of the Nibbanic experience, which is always fresh. So he's becoming discouraged suddenly because he's like, well, I went and knocked on all these doors and these were it. There's nobody else. But right at that moment, continuing on with the sutta, the thought occurred to him, to Sabhiya, but wait, the recluse Gautama also has a large group of disciples. He too is a teacher presiding over many assemblies and gatherings. He is well known and famed for having crossed over to the other shore. Then he thought to himself, what if I went and approached the recluse Gautama and asked him about the answer to this riddle? But then his other left brain kicked into gear, I guess you could say. where he started cross-questioning himself about the decision to go and see Lord Buddha. But then it occurred to Sabhiya again how the recluses and Brahmins he had gone to are old and advanced in years. As he reflected, these elders have led the holy life for a long time. Yet, when I asked for an answer to this riddle, they were unable to give me an answer, as well as becoming angry and annoyed with me, where they even cross-questioned me argumentatively. Now, if that is the case, then how could the recluse Gautama, who happens to be much younger than these elderly teachers, give me the answer to this riddle? So if they couldn't do it, how could this young, new kid on the block, if you will, be able to give me the answers to these very complex questions, he's thinking. After all, the recluse Gautama is young and has only recently gone forth. But then he pondered on the matter further and considered, even though many recluses may be young in age, however, recluses should neither be looked at with contempt nor their level of knowledge undermined. For it is a fact that there are young recluses who are both powerful in their psychic abilities as well as in being wise. So we see that he debated with himself and reached a solid conclusion. What if I approach the recluse Gautama and ask him for the answer to my riddle? So again, here we see how it is no coincidence where we see this sutta taking place at the earliest stages of the Buddha's career as a teacher, and also being the oldest, the Sutta Nipāta, this collection of suttas, which has been used again and again by the Buddha himself, where you have students who would come in and they would use references to one of these suttas in the Sutta Nipāta, and they would come to Lord Buddha and say, great teacher, or blessed one, when you said these verses, what did you mean? Could you, explain, elaborate on these? And that also allows us to crisscross and go back and identify the age of the Sutta Nipāta and the validity of the suttas being mentioned or in question, versus some other suttas that come out of nowhere and they're not mentioned other than just once in the Nikāyas. That's one way to know that there's a corruption, something that was added later on, definitely after the first council. So these things allow us to be a little bit more aware, to do our part in, if you will, textual analysis in our right, in identifying the legitimacy of some suttas, just the background of things to watch out for. So, having made up his mind, the wandering ascetic Sabhiya set off on his journey, walking in stages in the direction of the Blessed One, while knowing at that time that Lord Buddha was staying within the squirrel sanctuary in the royal city of Rajaga at the bamboo park. Once having reached the Blessed One, Sabhiya, the wandering ascetic exchanged friendly greetings with the teacher and then sat to one side and said, by the way, that is the proper way of asking a question to Lord Buddha and, of course, any of the bhikkhus or bhikkhunis. You cannot be standing while you're asking the question while the teacher is sitting. So it shows disrespect otherwise. So here's his approach. I have come to you with many doubts and with much trepidation, Blessed One, desiring to ask my questions. Please put them to rest, and may my doubts be dispelled by receiving my answers one by one according to the Dhamma. Something that I saw in researching this sutta was how the questions that we're going to see one after another, the commentators say that these questions contained in this sutta to be asked by Sabhiya had already been asked and answered at the time of Kassapa Buddha. But unfortunately, while the questions remained, the answers disappeared. So you need a Buddha to answer these questions. And that when the answers are not there, it means simply that you're living in a dark age as far as the Dhamma is concerned. So the questions trickle down eons later, and then here they are in front, have reached another Buddha, Lord Buddha. And let's see what he says. In reply, the Blessed One said, Sabhiya, you come from afar indeed, desiring to ask your questions. I will put your doubts to rest, dispelling them all, as I answer your questions one by one, according to the Dhamma. Ask now your questions, Sabhiya, however you wish, and I will put to rest each and every one of your questions, along with your doubts, one by one. Now, there is a term, it's called Sabbanyupavarana. Sabbanyupavarana is always used in relation to a Buddha. And not any kind of Buddha, not like a Pacheka Buddha, silent, or one that is unable to teach, but a fully self-awakened Buddha. So this statement which we just saw Lord Buddha make to Sabhiya, that I will be able to answer your questions one by one, that is a statement that only a Buddha can make. That's what we see in the suttas, that's what we see in the commentaries, because it entails giving the correct answer despite the nature of the question. So this is a quality that a Buddha has to have in order for them to be a Sabbanyuno, or self-awakened Buddha, Samma Sambuddha. So whatever the questioner might posit, the Buddha himself will be able to give this visitor the permission to ask it. And because then only a Buddha is capable to answer. Now, some might bring in the 10 questions that the Buddha refused to answer during his dispensation. Well, wait a minute, how come the Buddha didn't answer those? Well, very simple. They didn't lead to Nibbana. They didn't lead to wisdom. They were just metaphysical wanderings, just curiosities, which do not help to reduce suffering. So that's why Lord Buddha had told Ananda or Sariputta, if anybody comes over asking me these metaphysical questions, I'm not interested. I'm not engaging in any philosophical debates with anyone. I teach two things, the Buddha said, suffering and the way out of suffering. Knowing if a Buddha exists after death or not, how is that going to help you get rid of your suffering? End of argument. So there were 10 questions like these that the Buddha did not want. But the Sabbanyupavarana term is a quality that Lord Buddha could make such a statement, which he just did to Sabhiya. Then it occurred to the wandering ascetic Sabhiya, this is amazing. This is wonderful. While other recluses and Brahmins did not even give me a chance to speak or ask my questions fully, here, the recluse Gautama not only is giving me his consent, but is even encouraging me to ask my questions. In being thus inspired and thoroughly pleased, Sabhiya, the wandering ascetic, began asking the Blessed One his questions. By acquiring what can one be truly called a bhikkhu? What is self-restraint? and the meaning of being tamed. What is meant by awakening? May the Blessed One please explain these to me. And the Blessed One replied, Sabhiya, when he walks on the path that leads to release, when Nibbana is known for oneself and all doubts are finally removed, giving up both becoming and non-becoming, with no more rebirth awaiting for him, one lives out the very last of countless rebirths, completing the goal of the holy life. It is this person who is to be called a bhikkhu. Already we see this, the bar being set so high. We use the term bhikkhu left and right, or bhikkhuni left and right these days. It's like a, it's a term, just like any other term. But here we're seeing a sublime version of it being placed, properly defined as to how Lord Buddha understands the term. It's not loosely used. It's not open for interpretation in a sense. You see here the practice all throughout, walking the path that leads to release, to liberation. Nibbana is known for oneself. Pachattam veditabbo vinyuhiti. The person knows it for oneself through one's own efforts. Giving up both becoming and non-becoming. This is talking about also the asavas, the contaminants. Bhavasava, which is the desire to be, to become, or not become. Just you want it to be ending as soon as possible, which indicates a high level of attainments. But even that is not enough. So the person has to go beyond that, where no more rebirth is awaiting for this person. And the person is living the last of one's rebirths. There's not going to be any more rebirth. That is the person to be called a bhikkhu, Lord Buddha says. And then he continues to answer his second question, which was about self-restraint. Mindful and equanimous everywhere he goes, intending no harm to anyone in the world, never conceited. The recluse is one who has crossed over, unperturbed. This is his self-restraint. When we talk about precepts, when we talk about rules, in case of monks, for example, we need to always ask ourselves, who am I doing this for? Who am I restraining myself for ultimately? Especially when there's no one around you or no one can hear your thoughts. But your thoughts are there. So have you taken your sila inward? Has it become part of you? Is it truly internally virtuous behavior that's taking place inside of you? That's when self-restraint is moving from the superficial, well, I practice the 5 precepts. Thank you very much. Or the 8, or the 10, or the 227. Has it gone deeper into oneself? And this is where we see something I've mentioned again and again. Adisila, you see this a lot in the Anguttara Nikāya, which unfortunately does not get to be talked about in many circles these days for some reason, which I don't know why. But it should. Otherwise, it will lead to what Lord Buddha mentions here. Never conceited. There is absolute absence of mana, which is conceit. I am better than you. You are better than me. We are equal to each other. All conceit. But the true self-restraint is one that goes beyond, because the mind no longer is perturbed, Lord Buddha says here. Continuing on, living in the world, he is supported by faculties that are developed both internally and externally, as he piercingly sees through this and the other world. having already made good use of his time. This is the meaning of being tamed. The person has no time to lose. They're using their senses, their faculties, internally and externally. Externally, in this case, would be their physical body. That would be one way of interpreting it, of course, and in their own activities with the world. He piercingly sees through this and the other world. So when I started my journey on the Dhamma years ago, I would be shocked to see oftentimes individuals talking to me, explaining to me that the holy life at best can deliver us to a Deva realm. So study the suttas, memorize them, practice them, yeah, but Nibbana is not going to happen here, type of they actually explicitly said that to me several times in different circles of monks and nuns, which was surprising. So in this case, we're seeing here, he said, Lord Buddha says, he piercingly sees through this and the other world, and having made already good use of his time here. So there's no delay. So in other words, Samvega, the urgency is there. It's like the person's hair is on fire. They don't have time to postpone, to think about, well, I'll do it tomorrow. Well, next year, after I've done all my other things on my list, to-do list. Next, thoroughly discerning the residues of ages past, together with their constant arisings and vanishings. Pure, without any defilements or passions left in him, he arrives at the end of rebirth. This is the meaning of awakening. So basically, in a nutshell, he gave the answers to all of his questions, even the ones that are to come. But so you can consider the other questions to be like sub sections or like the footnotes of these. But just a quick, because there's a lot of them and I want to cover them in time, finish and have you ask questions if you have any. He says, thoroughly discerning the residues of ages past. Sannyas and sankharas often are things that we engage with in form of shadow boxing, if you will. We're constantly engaged with them. They make up who we are, what we think of life, we interpret life, notions, concepts, interpretations, expectations, labels, memories, can all fit into sanya, different definitions of it. Sankharas is the one that takes over this from sanya, the baton, and starts building and constructing the storyteller, if you will. It picks up a memory and boom, it takes off, it's gone. But these are all residues of ages past. Sometimes people ask, well, I need to get rid of this, or I need to know why am I so restless in my sit, or why do I have so much doubt about the teacher, the teaching, the Buddha, whatever. Or why do I get so drowsy? Okay, as a teacher, you would be able to tell them, for example, ask them, how's your precepts? Are you breaking any? Because usually it stems from there. However, that's not the whole story. We don't have a Buddha that can penetrate into one's past, in a limitless past, and identify, you did this in such and such a lifetime, which you're now dealing with. So what do? Sooner or later, the meditator needs to come to grips with the understanding that they need to stop caring about the sannyas and the sankharas, and just focus on their arising and vanishing. That's all. Adana patinisagga, picking up only to give up. Picking up only to give up. Instead of holding on to it, upadana, grasping, and saying, because the rest of your life is just going to be dedication to doing a dissertation on that in your mind and get nowhere. And time is passing. Valuable time is slipping through our fingers. So the Buddha says, understanding, but moving beyond, seeing their rising, seeing their disappearance, without being agitated with passion, viraga, the absence of passion or dispassion, that needs to be allowed to send down its roots in the person. Instead of running away from dispassion, we need to embrace that as a manifestation of our practice. Then, after Lord Buddha answered the first section of his questions, the wandering ascetic Sabhiya, rejoicing and being utterly pleased in hearing the Blessed One's response, asked a further question. By acquiring what can one be truly called a Brahmin? Earlier he was asking about Bhikkhu, now a Brahmin. Who is a recluse? And by doing what can one be washed, cleansed? How can one become a Naga? May the Blessed One please explain these to me. Then the Blessed One replied, Sabhiya, in being cleansed of all that is unwholesome, shaken off the impure, with a thoroughly collected mind that is stainless, he looks on, having completely overcome the cycles of rebirth and no longer being soiled by them. This is the meaning of being a true Brahmin. So there's no way that the person can be sullied by the unwholesome. It's almost like the image of walking through the mud and you come out of it and there's no mud left on you. There's no residue. Remember the Sanya and Sankharas. They are the great deceivers. They need time, however, in order for them to stretch themselves out and to try to be seemingly real. That is the thing that can carry over, just like the mud that can stick to you after you come out of a muddy pool. But when the person just drops off, the sanya, when they do occur, noticing not the content, not their details. Remember, just like in the case of Bahya, Lord Buddha was saying, when seeing, just see Bahya. When hearing, just hear. Don't stretch it out. Don't pull it into time and bring it over with you. And there won't be any residue. You would have already shaken off the impure. Why? Because you have been observing what really matters. They're arising and they're vanishing, which is another form of saying, another way of saying, seeing anicca take place. And when a person sees anicca take place, they immediately, and when it becomes a habit of seeing instead of the content of the sanya, suddenly, because of our seeing the anicca in every compounded conditioned thing, situation, phenomena, immediately there arises viraga, which is dispassion. There's disenchantment and then dispassion. We become dispassionate towards this thing, this experience, this object, this phenomenon. And as we discover that, there is cessation, there is an ending, nirodha. And because of that ending, the next time this same scenario or something similar to that happens, guess what? There is patinisagga, which is the giving up. The giving up. Earlier I was mentioning about adana patinisagga, picking up only to give up. That's what takes place. And a person who lives like this is the true Brahmin, Lord Buddha says. So he continues, giving up both good and bad, the calmed one no more gathers any dust. So he's saying what I was referring to. He knows this world and the other, while overcoming birth and death altogether. It is he who is called a recluse. And in the case of recluse, he's also Sabhiya, being a paribhajaka. He's referring to that. Who's really a paribhajaka, Bhante? Who is it? And Lord Buddha just gave it to him. It's not you walking around with dreadlocks, practically naked, sitting there amongst other peers of yours and talking and debating with fancy Sanskrit means nothing, because you're just gathering dust. Talk to me about overcoming death and birth altogether, and then I'll call you a paribhajaka, Lord Buddha is saying. Continuing on, having cleansed oneself of all wrong actions, whether in thought, words, or in bodily behavior in the world, there is no more desire left in him for either the celestial or human births. In this manner, he is considered to be washed. So we find this all throughout resonating in the suttas. Lord Buddha always is focusing on having the listener use whatever they heard to practice it, and not to say, well, I might not reach Nibbana in this life, but I can go to, let's say, the heavenly realms. The Buddha says, I'm here. I am here. Use me. I'm teaching you. Do these things to get yourself out of this mess called samsara. Don't waste time. Doing no wrong in the world, he cuts off all fetters that bind. Released, he goes freely everywhere, unattached and stainless. This is the meaning of being a true Naga. In Naga, I think I mentioned in last sutta class we had, Naga is a term for a class of beings. They are higher than humans. They're very powerful, and they usually are correlated, if I can say that word. They are introduced usually together with the devas, even though they're totally different classes from each other. The Nagas also, the word Naga represents a person who's achieved a certain status, specifically Arahant. And this is an honor that Lord Buddha wanted to honor the Naga beings by giving them this, denoting this term to refer to the Arahants. And also any organism that is huge and powerful, like an elephant, is called a Naga. It's also called a yogi who's very developed can be termed as a Naga. Whales and large organisms in the ocean also are called Nagas. The great Naga is considered to be the Buddha, as far as the suttas are concerned. And cutting all fetters, that means the samyojanas are all gone. That means the person is a full arahant. 10 are gone. The 10, both 5 lower and 5 upper fetters are destroyed. Now, the wandering ascetic Sabhiya rejoiced while being inspired and grateful in hearing the Blessed One's response. And with joy swelling in his heart, he asked a further question. How is the field won by the victor, according to the Buddhas? In what way is one cleverly skilled? Who is the wise one? And how can the sage be recognized? May the Blessed One please explain these to me. Then the Blessed One replied, Sabhiya, by having thoroughly considered all fields of existence, be they heavenly, human, or Brahma, while becoming disenchanted by all of them, one is released from the roots that bind a person to these realms. This is how the field is won by the victor, according to the Buddhas. Now, some translators explain this as the three levels of existence, like the Kama Loka, Rupa Loka, and Arupa Loka, or desire realm, form realm, and formless realm. And other times it can also be referring to the three defilements, Lobha, Dosa, Moha. So in here, it is more fitting to use these given the context. However, you can use them, of course, the other versions as well, because there's different versions of this. Some translators wanted to keep the verse-like, almost like poetic flow in the answers that Lord Buddha gives. I'm not a big fan of that, because as a meditating practitioner and a teacher of meditation, my focus is getting the juice out of what the Lord Buddha is trying to say to the best of my understanding, and sharing that and making that more contemporary in a language that people can understand given their practice or respective stages of the practice, rather. Having thoroughly considered all the treasure houses, whether found in the heavenly, human, or Brahma realms, while becoming disenchanted by all of them, one is released from the roots that bind a person to these treasure houses. This is the way in which one can become cleverly skilled. The roots that bind, fetters, shackles, trappings, traps, nets, all these are terms that we see a lot in this sutta. As we progress in our path, we gain a lot of ideas, concepts, sannyas, if you will. They are sannyas eventually. And a conceit comes up, certain experiences we might have, and all of a sudden we have ideas. We used to have different ideas, but now we have different ideas. We might even call them sublime, different, supramundane even, compared to looking down to where we came from. But essentially, so long as they're not relinquished, they are still roots and shackles that bind. They need to be relinquished. They need to be relinquished. And that is the message that we see all throughout the sutta. Here, the paragraph was saying, cleverly skilled, seeing through these. And this is also plays beautifully into what I was mentioning during the previous few talks I've given, where even the Dhamma I mentioned can become an addiction. It can become a fetter, a sangyojana itself. But no one's going to know your thoughts other than you. You might be so skilled to fool yourself and even the teacher. The teacher is you can easily convince a teacher of something or other. But the practice is the thing which is going to allow you and your own honesty to pierce through the ignorance. That is avidya. Because even the most knowledgeable Dhamma master, whatever you want to call it, can become full of avidya. So please, be cleverly skilled, Lord Buddha is saying. Having fully examined the mind's purity as well as the purity found in the external world, he becomes disenchanted by what they offer, the world. Looking upon them with wisdom that is truly pure, as he overcomes both the dark and the white, transcending both. It is by possessing this discernment that one is called wise. If you recall, in the beginning of the meditation, I mentioned, please stop forcing the mind to do something, anything, to stop moving, to do this, to reach a sublime state, to reach a jhana, etc. Because what that would be otherwise, you are dissatisfied with the way things are. So you want to change things. That's when we run into problems. We want to change things from what to what? From bad to good. There's several verses in the um, Kanda Vimutti, of Ajahn Mun. And he talks about the khandas and how to break free from them. And in it, he talks about beautifully, in verses as well. And he was an arahant, of course. He talks about good and bad and how these become impediments in the practice, in the mind of the practitioner. It binds us. It's like we putting the lasso around our own waist, around our own arms, by wanting constantly to experience the good, the other, which is another play of the sannyas. Nothing's different. It's the same thing, but just using a different language. So whether internally or externally, clearly distinguishing the genuine Dhamma for that which is not, from that which is not, meaning adhamma, he is one who is worthy of the veneration and love of devas and humans alike. Having transcended both the shackles and the trap, he is the one recognized as the sage. Simply because there are devas doesn't mean that they are enlightened or awakened. There's many deluded devas, but there's also devas who are arahants and noble disciples. So sometimes we need to make that distinction. But see, you see how each of these verses, they kind of are echoing elements of the previous paragraph, previous answers, such as treating the Dhamma in a way where it does not become an addiction means being able to distinguish what is adhamma from what is genuine Dhamma. And that's why we need to go back to the suttas and really get familiarized with them and never take it at face value. Our practice, or what some teachers are saying, we need to go back to the source. In hearing these words, the wandering ascetic Sabhiya again rejoiced while being inspired and grateful, listening as he did to the Blessed One's response. And with his heart and mind full of joy, he asked his next question. By acquiring what can one attain to perfect knowledge? How is one meticulously examined? In what way can one become full of effort? And for what reason is one called a thoroughbred? May the Blessed One please explain these to me. To this, the Blessed One replied in the following manner. Sabhiya, by examining all the knowledges available, whether those of recluses or Brahmins, one dismisses all feelings attached to them, remaining unblemished by the passions as he goes beyond all knowledge. He is the one who attains to perfect knowledge. Remember, Lord Buddha is saying this to a paribhajaka, a wandering ascetic, whose life has been all about gathering ideas, philosophical standpoints, different theorems, different ideas, interpretations of how metaphysical ideas, of course, and concepts, even beliefs, which inevitably lend the person to develop strong emotions, feelings towards them, meaning passions towards them. If you've ever watched the debate with, modern day individuals, talking heads, you see how things get quite impassioned rather quickly. And all civility goes out the door sometimes. People want to punch each other's lights out. And they all were like shaking hands, cordial, yes, please, you first, you sir, yes. Well, because they're lost in delusion. They're quite blemished by their passions, unlike what Lord Buddha is saying, becoming or remaining unblemished by the passions and going beyond all knowledge. Next, having understood both internally and externally the proliferation of materiality and mentality, namarupa, the root cause of disease, one is then released from all the roots that pervasively tie one up to suffering. In this way, one becomes meticulously examined, being able to identify nama from rupa. Remember, rupa is what we get from our parents, comprised of roughly the 4 primary elements. And then when we get to the nama portion, we're talking about the mental qualities, intention, attention, perception, etc. So being able to identify something that a little bit more down-to-earth reference could be made to, remember when I used to train people in fitness and nutrition, and people would come to me and I would ask them, how often do they eat food? And their complaint, let's say in one example, is about obesity or overeating. So my job at one point or another would be to tell this person to distinguish as to where the hunger was coming from. Was there hunger? Because oftentimes there is a lack of appetite, but the brain is coming in and says, hey, we're supposed to eat this bagel, even though they are not hungry, versus listening to the body when it is hungry. And if one listens to the body when it is hungry and just eats during that window, during that time, guess what? They're not going to get overweight. Chances are. Of course, there are exceptions, and people might say, well, wait a minute, No, it's these distinctions need to be made. And this is just one, again, superficial example, but being able to distinguish what's happening internally and externally vis-a-vis Namarupa and how they drag us in. Identification is another example. This is me, this is my race, this is my ethnicity, these are my people, etc. All of these are proliferations, getting us nowhere except stuck. Refraining from all evil actions, exerting oneself with persistence, and leaving behind all hellish misery. His perseverance is relentless, always arousing himself with renewed effort to steadily endeavor with resoluteness, despite everything. It is in such a way that one becomes full of effort. I mean, I don't think there was anything left to doubt the importance of effort there in the Lord Buddha's answer. But something came to mind regarding the 5, if you recall, the 5 bhikkhus, one of whom is Sabhiya, we're covering today, on that rock, top of the rock where they were starving. Well, the first of the 7 who became an arahant, and later the Anāgami, 2 days later he became an Anāgami, these 2, in attaining the first one, arahantship, the second one, Anāgami, non-return, they also attained access to psychic abilities. It does happen with meditators who attain to those lofty states of arahantship especially. But it seems that these were taking place at the time of Lord Buddha a lot more frequently, because we see them a lot in the suttas, where a person reaches arahantship, and all of us, including Venerable Ananda, for example, after attaining arahantship, he had psychic abilities, whereas others did not, like even Venerable Sariputta didn't have those abilities. But versus today, today as in when you read stories of arahants, Sayadaws or Ajahns or Bhantes in Sri Lanka, they're not going to flaunt the abilities. You're not going to see them on front news or page about their abilities. But I just wanted to mention how the effort part. Yes, sorry, I deviated. They both brought food for the other 5. They went, flew through the air, brought food to them, for them. But they were like, no. They even asked the question, Friends, did we have a pact in the beginning when we threw away the ladder that if one of us attains and goes and gets food, we're going to eat? And they say, no, we didn't have that pact. Okay, then leave us alone. Let us practice our adhitthana, our determination, and push through. Well, there goes that life, because those 5 died. And they just went loitering, or, just lingering in the Deva realms, when they could have at least attained Sotapanna stage, which none of them had attained. So we need to be exercising wisdom. That is why I paused here with the full of effort, because without wisdom, as is the case with any of the principles covered in the Dhamma, without wisdom, it can be a stumbling block. It can be a hindrance, if you will. Even adhitthana can become, because it's no longer adhitthana, it's no longer pure determination, because there is some conceit there. Just like it was with Bahya, who was conceited into thinking that he was an arahant when he wasn't. People were respecting him, bowing down, giving him food, but he thought, well, maybe I am an arahant. No, you weren't. And that's where his friend came to tell him. So conceit can never replace full of effort that Lord Buddha is talking about. And the Deva, the Anāgamin Brahmā, God who's there, urging them, is really going above and beyond and being so loving and caring and compassionate to find these 5 companions of his from a previous life. And because they were simply conceited. Had they eaten, chances are they would have attained in that very lifetime. Because it sounds like they had the paramis, because those 2 others did attain. At the very least, they could have attained Sotapanna. Indefinitely being brought food would allow them, because they did have the energy, which is wonderful. Let's go back to the sutta. Having severed the fetters both internally and externally, cut loose from their roots and sticky snares, being fully released finally from all entanglements that bind, he is one recognized as the thoroughbred. Hearing these words, the wandering ascetic, Sabhiya, felt his heart gladden and rejoice even more, while being thankful for the Blessed One's words, as he continued to ask his next question. By acquiring what can one be said to be wisely learned? In what way can one be called noble one? How can one be developed in good conduct? And how does one become a wandering ascetic? Again, we go back to the paribhajaka, wandering. How can I be a better paribhajaka, is saying, or what is the idea? May the Blessed One please explain these to me. And the Blessed One replied by saying, Sabhiya, by seeing the true essence behind all phenomena, directly knowing the Dhamma wherever one looks in the world, for he has conquered both the faulty and the faultless. With unprecedented certainty in his heart, wherever he is to be, he remains untroubled and released. This is the one said to be wisely learned. Having conquered both, whatever is blameworthy and whatever is blameless, they've surpassed. It's another way of saying good and bad. That doesn't mean that the Arahant now is going to go ahead and break the precepts. No, not at all. They're one and the same. Mahasati is there, Mahapanya is there, and when you have Mahasati that's always there with you, mindfulness, it's impossible for the person to break any precepts, any rules. They are the Dhamma. And that's why the Lord Buddha says unprecedented certainty in his heart. That means there's no doubt whatsoever, which also means the person has reached the state of arahantship. Ajahn Mahabua, for example, encouragingly says how until one reaches arahantship, there's going to be a smidgen, a little bit at least, of uncertainty. even if a person is Sotapanna, Sakadagami, or Anāgami, until we've reached that state of arahantship. That's when we will get to that purest form of uncertainty. There's no more doubt at all about oneself. I'm not talking about the Dhamma, because that comes with no more doubts. That is, comes when a person attains the vision, which is the first stage. Having cut himself free from the contaminants, asavas, he no longer settles anywhere. Directly knowing this for oneself, he does not come to any womb again. Uprooting the threefold sannyas that defile, with no further substrates to seek out further or rely upon, he indeed is the one known as a noble one. There's no more womb to go to, meaning there's no birth. This past week was my birthday, and I had some people text me or message me and saying, "Oh, may you." I had one particular person say, "Oh, may you have many, many births." And I went like, "No, no, 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 no! Don't make that wish for me." It's the worst thing that you could tell a person. That's one of the reasons why we can say that as Buddhists, we're terrified not of death, but of births, because of what it entails. The one living the holy life, having seen the Dhamma, is established in higher virtuous behavior, while understanding the teachings, living with versatility, while freed from all inner agitation. With his heart thus liberated from both attachment and revulsion, it is he who is considered one of good conduct. So there isn't like and dislike. So basically we have passed beyond sanya, worshiping the sanya. We're seeing sanya for what they are. We're seeing sankharas for what they are. And these are not terms. They're not terms that we memorize. These are not things that we see, this and that. Yeah. No, these are living experiences that only you know when you're going through it, but in the presence of wisdom. When there is agitation in the heart, in the mind, there is sanya dominating, period. When there is agitation in the mind or heart, there is sankhara at work. That's what we mean by identification. This is me, this is mine, this is who I am. The sannyas are the great deceivers. We lose our grip on the sanya, we lost it. So we need to be really, really holding those reins tightly on the sanya. Observing as they come up, not trying to get rid of them, because they will go on their own, because they're also anicca. They're conditioned by things and actions we've committed through eons, which are just normal ripples that are now reaching us at the edge of this life. Whatever intended actions that ripen into suffering and distress, whether above, below, all around, and in between, he completely gives them all up, dropping conceit, craftiness, greed, and anger. He puts an end to Namarupa, making him the one to be called the wandering ascetic, the one accomplished indeed. Here's where the Blessed One's responses finish to the questions of Sabhiya, and we'll see soon how they impact Sabhiya. What we don't see in the sutta is that in addition to Sabhiya, there was another person, which the commentaries of the Theragatha, where we have Sabhiya's verses, mention the last verse, portions of the verses, where the Buddha kind of goes, almost like scoldingly addressing. And if you're very careful with the verses, you'll see like, what was that all about? Type of a thing. And the commentary of the Theragatha tells us that there was, along with Sabhiya, a companion of his, Yasadatta, who was also a paribhajaka, who had joined him on his trip to go and see the Buddha. But his intention was not necessarily pure, meaning he wanted to engage in a debate with Lord Buddha. So he was just basically taking notes, taking notes. Okay, okay, yeah, you said this to that one. Okay, let me come back to this later on because I'm going to have a rebuttal here, mister. Like, oh yeah, 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 oh yeah. So as Yasadatta is doing that, Lord Buddha turns to him, reading his mind, and just shakes him up a little bit. And this is in case you want to see the verse. It's in Book of Fours in the Theragatha in chapter 1, 4.3. And Lord Buddha, I copy pasted here Lord Buddha's statement to Yasadatta. He says, whoever has no respect for their spiritual companions is as far from true Dhamma as the sky is from the earth. And in the commentary, they say this so impacted Yasadatta, kind of broadsided him. He didn't know where it came from, but he was shaken to the point where he realized his mistake immediately, and he also joined the Bhikkhu orders, and in time also attained arahantship. So back to the sutta itself. Then, in hearing these long-awaited responses spoken by the Blessed One, the wandering ascetic Sabhiya, grateful, inspired, and utterly pleased, quietly and with the utmost care, arose from his seat, and while arranging his upper robe on one shoulder, and with his palms gently joined in front of his heart, came closer and began venerating the Blessed One, while speaking these heartfelt verses. O great teacher of vast wisdom, you have transcended the dark flood, crossing over the 63 wrong views of the wandering ascetics, doctrines that are false refuges, each and every one, depending on nothing more than hearsay, baseless concepts, conclusions about others' statements in empty words. You have gone to the very end, the farther shore, existing beyond suffering. You are the Arahant, rightfully self-awakened one. And I have firm faith that the Blessed One has destroyed all the contaminants. You are resplendent, wise beyond any measure. O finisher of dukkha, you have delivered me from suffering. Whatever doubts I had, you dispelled them by carrying me over to the other shore. I pay homage to you, O unequaled sage, you who dwell in the attainment of deep understanding. You are gentle and kind, O kinsman of the sun. Whatever uncertainties I had earlier, the wise one dispelled them for me. Being the one who sees in the pitch blackness of ignorance, you indeed are the all-knowing sage with no hindrances left. All your troubles are cut at their roots and made useless. You are a result of the Dhamma, self-tamed, cooled, and the essence of truth. O best of men, great hero, the greatest of Nagas, all gods rejoice in listening to your words, including the Naradas and Pabbatas. Homage to you, O thoroughbred. Homage to you, O greatest of men. In the vastness of world systems, whether of gods or humans, there is none to compare to you. You are the awakened one. You are the generous teacher. You are the sage who has conquered Mara. You have removed all the underlying corruptions, the anusayas, from the heart. Having crossed over, you guide the rest of us, so we too transcend to the other shore. You have gone beyond all endearments, with contaminants, asavas, completely torn apart. You are a lion, free of grasping, having abandoned all fears, big or small. As a graceful lotus stands stainless above the surface, not being smeared whether by mud or water, you are not smeared whether by good or evil. Kindly stretch your feet, O hero, so I may touch it with my forehead. For Sabhiya has found his teacher. Beautiful, just beautiful. And in these statements we see when he says the uncertainties are gone, he just declared that he is now a Sotapanna at the very least. His delusions, his uncertainties, his doubts are gone. At the very least, he has attained Sotapanna because he has now the Dhamma eye to see all these qualities. So he's not just giving accolades and just, complimenting Lord Buddha, if you will. These are things that he's feeling viscerally, as demonstrated by his very last statement, because he has found his teacher finally. Then Sabhiya, the wandering ascetic, by gently placing his head at the feet of the Blessed One, said, "It is excellent, Lord. It is marvelous, Bhante. The Blessed One has made the Dhamma clear to me in many ways. I feel as though the Tathagata has turned upright what was overturned, revealing what was hidden, showing the correct path to someone who was lost, as though one were to bring a lamp into the darkness for all those with eyesight to see. Bhante, I go for refuge to the Blessed One, to the Dhamma, and to the Sangha of Bhikkhus. May I be given the going forth and the higher ordination in the Blessed One's presence." So going forth is the Samanera ordination, novice ordination, and the higher ordination is the Upasampada. So he's asking them for them. But because he's coming from a different sect, a different tenet, a different belief system, then there are certain rules which we'll find out. And the Blessed One said, "Sabhiya, anyone who has belonged earlier to another sect or belief, who desires the going forth and the higher ordination in this dispensation, should stay under probation for 4 months. And only at the end of those 4 months, that period, if the bhikkhus are satisfied, they would give him the going forth and a higher ordination. Although this is put in place, I, nevertheless, do recognize individual differences in this matter." So Lord Buddha is saying, I can make exceptions to that, because he sees the mind of Sabhiya, whether there is a tinge of, you know what, let me fall back. Because when a person has spent their whole life in wrong views, and we saw 63 major wrong views that the Paribhajakas advocate, it's very difficult for a person to recoil from those and have revulsion and push them away, given the Dhamma's revelation in their life, if you want to call it, the light that it is. That is something that Buddha or somebody like Venerable Anuruddha might be able to see as they envelope their mind with this person's. So that's just a footnote. And then we see Sabhiya's response. Bhante, if it is so that anyone who has belonged earlier to another sect or belief, who desires the going forth and the higher ordination in the Blessed One's dispensation, should stay under probation for 4 months, and only at the end of that 4 months period, if the bhikkhus are satisfied, they would give him the going forth and higher ordination. Then I am willing to be under probation for 4 years, at the end of which may the bhikkhus be satisfied and give me the going forth and the higher ordination. This validates that what we were concluding earlier, that he's like, okay, 4 months, no, well, let's go with 4 years. I'm okay with that, because this is my life now. Again, when a person has truly seen with the eye of Dhamma, attaining the first level of awakening, it's, or the fruition of it rather, there's no way anyone can come and pay you enough money for you to relinquish it, because it's so real. It's you, if you want to call it that. It's so certain. So that's what he's saying here. I am certain, Bhante is saying. I don't care if it's 4 years. Then the wandering ascetic Sabhiya obtained the going forth and the higher ordination in the dispensation of the Blessed One. Soon after the higher ordination, the Venerable Sabhiya, while living on his own, ardent, secluded, withdrawn from the crowd, diligently striving in his practice and with resoluteness, soon realized for himself and with direct knowledge in this very life the highest goal of the holy life, for the sake of which good sons of families rightfully go forth from the lay life into homelessness. And he personally knew and understood with absolute certainty. Now, birth is destroyed. The holy life has been fully lived. What had to be completed has now been completed. There is no more rebirth into any state of becoming, with nothing more to wish for. And the Venerable Sabhiya became one of the Arahants. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. That completes the circle of 5 bhikkhus that we have been closely following for a few weeks. And I will pause now and open for questions you may have. Thank you for listening. Any questions? Thoughts, comments? It's a lovely sutta, isn't it? Their lives weren't that different than ours, although the mind wants to think that they were, but they're not. Every time you sit to meditate, you're experiencing the same difficulties that Venerable Sariputta faced, Venerable Sabhiya faced, and everyone that you read about. Perhaps not Venerable Bahya. But sometimes we like to pull ourselves out of the equation and say, no. My case is different. Our time is different. Or that's another form of delusion where sanya and sankharas are really doing their number on us. And it's crucial for us to be aware and alert. And sanyas cannot exist if we take them out of from the temporal scene, meaning the past or the future. The next sutta that I would like to cover with you, I think that will be week 10, not next week, the one after, will be on the Bhante Karatta Sutta, where the first line of the verse says, no longer being overtaken by thoughts of the past, or of the future. But that's where we usually linger. That's where sanyas are. You take the past and the future, sanyas, just like mannequins, they just like drop. There's no life. And it is our life that they're stripping us from. And yeah, just they're very sneaky, very tricky. So being mindful of them is a good thing. It needs to be a constant thing. Any thoughts, questions?
Bhante, thank you for your discussion and reading of the sutta. I just wanted to mention how that was a wonderful criteria that you shared with us in terms of detecting whether sanya is acting in us, whether asking ourselves, is are my thoughts about the past or are my thoughts about the future? And immediately one can know that, oh, okay, well, I'm time involved in time traveling, in other words. So that's, I find that to be a great way to, a criterion to detect whether sanyas are at work.
Yes, and they use the six senses very well. They're very attached to each other. What I mean by that is it could be a flavor, it could be a smell, especially if you're, let's say, hungry and you smell someone cooking or incense or something, or a smell that is not appealing. Instead of being carried over by what, because sanyas are there, they will come. Why? Because there was contact. With what? Well, the nose made contact with a smell. Okay? That created consciousness immediately. And because of that, there's the contact, right? So the contact, Sanya says, I got this. It's so fast. Sanya jumps in and says, thank you guys, appreciate it. Goes in and starts building this Hollywood type of like story. Suddenly your heart is racing, your muscles are getting tighter, and there's someone, let's say someone's sitting next to you and asking you a question. You're not there though. You're gone in La La Land. That is the real La La Land. Because the senses have done their thing, but because of a lack in mindfulness, the person wasn't able to catch it fast enough. So how can we catch it? How can we catch sanyas from taking over and just going? The moment you are able to smell any smell, before it goes down the junction, right? Like in the Vammika Sutta, we had the junction where, keep digging with the sharp object, wise one. And there was a junction, there was a fork in the path. Don't be pulled into that. Meaning, oh, it's a lovely smell. Oh, yes, patchouli smell. Yes, I remember when I was in Sri Lanka. No, leave it there. Oh, that's a horrible smell. Like we had a neighbor that used to cook something or dead something, and that's where this mind is. No, both are irrelevant. Both are glued to the black hole that is sanya. And once you go with either one of them, you're sucked into the, if you will, like get a little bit scientific on this one, event horizon. And you can't be pulled out of that. You pass the point of no return. You're going to be pulled into the sanya, to the story. So instead, the moment you detect, and this is where mindfulness has to be holding your hand constantly, would come in and say, what is that? Not the quality of the smell. This is what Lord Buddha was saying to Bahya. Don't be pulled in. You're not going to be in it, of it, by it, within it, in between it. None of that. But you'll just smell and you will identify it as, this is smelling. This is the process of smelling. Okay. And guess what? You just cut the cord. You're no longer bound up. What we saw here several times being mentioned by the roots and the shackles or the traps of the sannyas. Because sannyas are by themselves, they're attached to the fetters, the more and more things that bind. And the asavas is another word, another phrase, another term for them. So are defilements, the kileshas. So it's far more useful, I've discovered, and from my own practice, to instead of sitting down and delineating what categories these things represent, what these are, let's say asavas, kileshas, sangyojanas, all these things, contaminants, defilements, fetters, all these things, instead of, because that can take us into intellectualizing, we can turn into one of the paribhajakas like Sabhiya was. And that's when even Dhamma can turn into wrong view. Yes, Dhamma can turn into wrong view when we attach ourselves to it, the teachings. And it's not, nothing's going to be done with the Dhamma. The Dhamma is Dhamma. The teachings are the teachings. But for us, it will become a hindrance. And the person will not see beyond their ego, beyond their conceit, beyond their idea of what is supposed to be the case. So instead of getting into that intellectual world of having everything make sense, bring it to the body, bring it to the body. That's more real. Because the six senses are here. And they're always communicating. They're always communicating with the outside world and the inner, of course. But the one to detect it, as always, is none other than the protagonist in this case, which is sati, mindfulness. To get it to become mahasati eventually, great sati, where it goes with you everywhere you go. I sometimes, for newbies, complete newbies, people who've never meditated proper, they don't practice, individuals such as people I try to help in psychotherapeutic circles, in trying to introduce mindfulness to them, sometimes I say, I recently shared this technique with them. I said, how about this? Every time you walk from one room to the next, you're going through a doorway of some sort. Can you be mindful as to which foot you are entering or exiting with? And he went, yeah, I could do that. So forget about the breath or anything. Just try to make mindfulness more and more dynamic, in motion. That way, it allows the person to become a lot more cognizant. So you'll have more pockets here, more pockets of mindfulness here, but eventually they'll turn wider, they'll become bigger and more pronounced until they join each other. And now you have mindfulness throughout the day, most of the day, which is wonderful, because that means you have that much of an opportunity, which you didn't up to that point, more opportunity for wisdom to come in. And that's what's going to allow us to see the junction as like, oh, no. I'm not going to step into that trap. So yes. Any other thoughts, questions? Yes.
Bhante, so as usual, I like to be able to apply what I hear you saying, at least, into my own life, and to know when I'm actually achieving what I should be and when I may be on the wrong path. So when I hear you talk about the sannyas and not being taken to the past, etc., I'm just trying to get clear in my mind where this would take me. Am I would I be considering that I'm successful if when a sanya arises, I immediately give it up. I pick it up and I give it up. And so when something arises, I can let it go and it doesn't become the habit. And I can also replace it perhaps with something wholesome if it is unwholesome. Or is the achievement we're looking for more where we don't have any sanya in the first place? And to my mind, that would certainly keep us in the present. It would stop us going into the past, into the future. But I can't imagine easily a time where, or people operating in real life with no sanya. We wouldn't be able to exist. People would always have to do things for us. And obviously I've heard stories of people having to care for arahants, and perhaps that's part of the reason why. But I can't imagine not having some level of perception and identification and then making decisions about what would have to be done based on where we are and what we're doing. So am I incorrect in thinking that we should eliminate sanya completely? Or is it just the fact we're looking for an ability to let it go and get rid of any unwholesome thoughts and out of the past and stay in the present, be mindful when we have sanya?
The two options that you presented, they're both juicy. And I like to start with the first one, which has to do with, well, is there a point of eliminating, no more having sanya? Is that what we're shooting for? Is that what we need to look forward to, what we're practicing towards? Well, no, because the function of the mind is to think. But what it does when it's diluted, it thinks uncontrollably. There's a lot of identifications that take place, meaning sannyas have become the reigning king or kings, but they happen one at a time, just like vijnanas. They follow one after another, but just the succession is pretty quick. So the person is unable to detach oneself from the sannyas, detach oneself from the sannyas. Why? Because there is this strong identification that we have that this is happening to me, whatever it is. This will happen to me in the future. So there's dread, worry, fear, for example, or looking forward to, expectation, etc. Similarly, with something that has happened in the past, regrets, remorse. Oh, I broke a precept. Oh, I broke all the precepts for years, decades. Oh, wow, how am I going to ever redeem myself, etc. Again, identification. But it could be something even more, simpler. The way I understand it, I'm not an arahant. The way I understand it is that even an arahant will have these things because they're thinking. Now, what they do not, based on my research, they do not make new kamma, new action, be it by thought, be it by speech, be it by physical action. They're called, I once read somewhere, it's called Kiriya Chitta. It's a pure action in a sense, because there is no, their hands are not sticky. Their fingers are not sticky. They don't hold on to images. A typical situation would be something like an arahant getting mad at a student, seemingly mad, scolding a student. And some of these teachers in history, you would see them like really getting upset and visibly, and because they are in the presence of wrong view, or their student comes in and they're full of conceit, and the teacher has to intervene, shake them off. The Buddha said, if you have a wood chip or a thorn going into your skin. You need something as sharp, if not sharper, to pull it out with. So if there is ignorance, you need to go in. And for some of these arahants, like Ajahn Mun was notorious for that. He would just really tear a student up. But then the next moment, it's like a totally different person. Literally the next moment. That was what was necessary at that moment, however. That moment itself dictated that type of a response, not even a reaction. And when you go and sit down and talk with someone like that, I'm presuming here, of course, they wouldn't necessarily, well, they wouldn't be dwelling on, can you believe that guy? I can't believe this. All these years I've been teaching you and you still come around and give me that stupid statement. Like, how could you call yourself my, none of that. Because they're so tender, so alive. It's as if every moment is fresh. Every moment is fresh. I mean, you see Devadatta. I mean, how bad of a person does a person need to be called evil? And this guy was it. Devadatta, Buddha's own cousin, brother-in-law, actually, also. And he tried to kill him, literally. And then he would come back and Lord Buddha would still, like he wouldn't have any grudges or anything like that, which would indicate the presence of sanya identification. Now, does that mean that Lord Buddha did not have thoughts? Aha. What we do is we attach sanya to the stream of thoughts that are happening. Thoughts, meaning I'm seeing, in this case, I'm using the 6 senses, for example. When the sanya come in and attach themselves, glue themselves to this water, me tasting the water, that is, or seeing the water, hoarding the water, not allowing you to drink because I'm keeping it for myself. Well, I might need it later. This is all we have between the both of us. What happened? All these stories came in. That will not happen in the mind of a person who is released. Released from what? Liberated from what? It's not like we reach the end of the pool after swimming like a limitless amount of laps, and now we have to come to the dry land, and we're done. Thank you very much. But it's much more pervasive than that, I would say, much more personal than that, much more real than that, much more involved with our lives, that is. And because it can easily turn into something metaphysical. Like the questions that I was referring to earlier, like what happens to an arahant after they die? Do they go somewhere? Do they go to, just like you say, pure abodes for the Anāgamis? There's 5 realms. Maybe there might be a realm for Buddhas. Aha. And now we opened up another can of worms. And we're deviating further and further down, totally in Sanya land. Versus seeing the 6 senses as they occur, instead of attaching a story. So that attachment of a story in that sense doesn't happen. So if that means sanyas don't occur anymore, yes. In that sense, yes. However, when I say there's no sanyas at all happening, a person might start thinking there's no thinking in the mind, because, and that's dangerous in my opinion, because the Arahant is very alert, very aware. They are the embodiments of Mahasati and Mahapanya after all, for a reason. They don't stop keeping or the rules, for example, the 227 rules we must keep as bhikkhus. They don't stop, even though, you know, the boat, the raft is tossed aside. You know, Lord Buddha talked about the Dhamma being a raft. You don't carry it over the mountain over your head after you got to the other shore. It drops it, but they are now living the Dhamma, but they are not collecting any dust like the verse said today. They don't collect dust. So if you wish to use the dust metaphor analogy as a representation of sannyas, by all means. Because you also, Kanda Vimutti, I mentioned earlier, Vajjan Mun's work, where he says, he asks someone, he's doing a riddle basically. So he's asking this character, what dies? What dies? And the character responds to this riddle's question, that portion, it says, sankharas die. So there's no more constructing to go on. In that sense, yes, there are no more. And that's what I was referring to as being fresh all the time. All the time. And you have many examples of meditators, bhikkhus, who came out of a long meditation, sit, and the other bhikkhus turn to them and say, wow, your face is glowing. Your face is glowing. Like you have that example happen. The one, I mean, there's so many, but the one that comes to mind is Venerable Sariputta asking Venerable Ananda, I believe, what were you practicing? What was your object today? You know, or Venerable Mahakassapa. They would come out of their Nirodha Samapatti, where they were in cessation, perception and feeling. Perception and feeling, there's ceased. It has ceased. Now, but because the Buddha or the Arahants have to function in the world, they still use this basically, both of your questions are tied into the aggregates, the khandas. So in that sense, the way I understand this, of course, is when an awakened person, an arahant, is living out their days. It's also called attainment with residues. Saupadisesa, the term is. So they still have the residues of what? Residues of what? Egos, conceit, defilements? No, some people actually made those mistakes, considering the arahants not fully that good. And the Mahayana people later on, they use some of these things to justify their own false claims, and saying, even actually putting down the arahants as low quality meditators compared to the one that they were promulgating. So anyhow, but in the case of the arahant, they are not adding more defilements or anything like that. It's cleansed, but and they're not adding more akusala kamma either, because as I said earlier, it's impossible for them to break sila. And if they do, they just didn't know it. So there isn't that intentionality behind the action. That's one. And the khanda portion, the body, if you remember, the four great elements, that's the rupa portion of the nama rupa. But you have the intention, you have the attention, you have the perception, all these things that are necessary to run the nama portion. But then we haven't even talked about sanya, sankhara, right? And vedana, of course, and vijnana, sense awareness. So these things will be with the arahant so long as they're alive. Once they breathe out their last breath, however, anupadisesa takes place. They don't have any residues. So you do have arahants who have attained in the suttas, in the Nikāyas, and immediately they died. They wanted to die, basically. They reached that point, or they were on the verge of death, and where they died like that. There are cases where a bhikkhu was really desperate, and he had been trying so hard and diligently working, sleepless nights. And again, he didn't have the necessary paramis to develop fast enough. But he lacked in the adhitthana department, the determination department, up until that moment where he made the very strong determination that I'm going to die. This life is worthless for me if I don't attain freedom from delusion, from avidya. At that moment, as he's about to die, he attains arahantship. And they say, Lord Buddha sees this in his mind, but he also knew that he was about to reach it. So it was pointless for him to go. And when an arahant actually dies like that, they call it blameless. It's a blameless death. So not to promote suicide or anything like that, you know, but it's called blameless. There's so many examples of this. So anyhow, Lord Buddha also sees this thing going around at night, and I believe it was near the Vulture's Peak in Rajgir. It's a beautiful place. It's on top of a cliff. There's this open plateau area, small. So that's where the Buddha used to sit. And he would see these things moving around. And I believe one of the students asked him, Bhante, what is that? And he says, oh, that's Mara. He's trying to find where the consciousness of this bhikkhu landed. And he's very frustrated because he can't find him. He's going around everywhere, every nook and cranny of existence, from the highest of Brahma realms, minus the pure abode, down to the lowest hells. He can't find him. He's thinking that he did not attain. And the Buddha says, but he did. That was the last of him. We're going to see him, the bhikkhu. So I don't know, I'm giving you a lot of things. I hope I'm able to satisfy you with your question.
Thank you. Yes, I think my question was based on my thought that with some thinking there was also perception, but you're making it clear the distinction that we can be thinking without perception, and that's where the answer came from.
Yes, but some people who are, you know, are going to nitpick that answer, possibly. They're going to say, wait a minute, is the Arahant alive? And if the Arahant is still alive, then they'll say, well, the aggregates are there, so it means that he is awakened with residue remaining, meaning the aggregates are there. And so long as we consider sanya to be part of the aggregates, and it is, they are, then the person might say, there goes that statement or answer that you've provided. The reason why I said perception and thinking, that I made that distinction between the two, I was referring to sanya with its dustiness, the dusty quality to it, where Lord Buddha is saying, there's nothing that can, like, there's no dust to gather in the mind of the person. So I was just referring to that interpretation of sanya, because if sanya is always, at least when I represent it here, talk about it, is the architect, the magician, then it's nothing good, right? So, but in essence, perception, it has become convoluted because of our stamping of identity onto it through countless eons of samsara, of rebirths. So we cannot even conceive of a perception where it is just pure, meaning no images left over from the previous moment. Again, I'm not an arahant, so an arahant would be the most suitable. Anybody less than an arahant, I believe, will give a less than 100% satisfactory response, I would believe. So I will stop there. But, we do our best and work towards that. Any other thoughts or comments, questions before we close for today?
Thank you very much, Bhante. I guess if we were to recall the very, initial definition for dukkha given in the Four Noble Truths, it's jatipi dukkha, jarapi dukkha, birth is dukkha, aging is dukkha, bhyahipi dukkha, maranampi dukkha, soka paridewa dukkha, domana supayasapi dukkha, and sankitena, in short, pancha upadana dukkha, pancha upadana kanda dukkha. In other words, the practice is not to get rid of the khandas, but rather to get rid of the attachment towards the khandas. Mm-hmm. So, I guess we have to live with Vedana, our form, our Vedana, Sanya, Sankara, Vijnana, and the goal is not to get rid of them, but to get rid of the attachments towards them. I hope that makes sense.
Oh, yes. Thank you for your contribution there. Very well placed. Yes, and we see that term a lot. And I believe it was in the previous, in Kumara Kassap's riddles, the riddle of the Vammika Sutta, where near the end of the questions, where we are finding, I believe it was the tortoise, where Lord Buddha talks about the 5 aggregates. But he doesn't say 5 aggregates. He doesn't say just the 5 aggregates. He also says the 5 grasping aggregates. Grasping aggregates. That's what I was referring to earlier in my answer to you, Greg, of this is mine, this is me. I use the word identification, which is another form of grasping, of course. So even feeling or Vedana is very, very personalized in the mind of a non-arahant. But the arahant will look at the feeling as just feeling, as the example was with Bahya. That's what Lord Buddha was trying to teach him. And he did a good job in teaching him because he got it. When you see, just see. Seeing is perceiving. Seeing is a perception, which denotes consciousness, which denotes in itself the sense organ and the sense object. So, but the problem with most of us is that we make it our own. That's why we call it the grasping aggregate. Grasping. Kanda upadana. And that's what I was referring to earlier when I was referring to adana patinisagga. The term actually is adana upadana patinisagga, but we are removing the upadana from the center, the grasping part, because it's like a bunch of people, when there's a flash flood and there's a bunch of people trying to help stop, creating some type of a barrier to stop the flooding of the river, for example. So everybody's got sandbags. Some people are filling it up, but you have 100 people passing the the sandbag over, passing it, picking it up, giving it away, picking it up, giving it away. The Arahant is the perfect example of that. He will never pick up the sandbag and hold. But that's what we do. That is using the khandha with upadana. This is my perception. This is my sense awareness, etc. So these are ways of looking, and each of us will see things from our own perspective to some degree, but essentially they have to come to unison in the understanding that, especially given the question, that the khandhas are not gonna leave a person simply because they are an arahant. You see this, however, in certain yogi cultures, like you see it in India, where people have to go and dress the person, they have to feed them with a spoon. It's almost like a zombie. The person has become a vegetable. That's not the arahant of Lord Buddha's dispensation. That never is the case. If the person behaves like that, they're definitely not practicing the Dhamma. They're doing something else. So I hope, but thank you for that, Upatissa. So I'll stop here. And if you have any further questions, please email them to me and I'll do my best to respond. May suffering ones be suffering free and the fear-struck fearless be. May the grieving shed all grief and may all beings find health relief. May all beings share in these merits that we have thus acquired for the acquisition of all kinds of wholesome happiness. May beings inhabiting space and earth, devas and nagas of mighty power share in these merits. May they long protect the Buddha's dispensation. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And I'll see you next week. Please be safe and practice without forcing the mind to do any acrobatics. Just be with whatever's happening. But no, don't fool yourselves. This is what's supposed to be happening. Just observe. There's so much going on for us to see. So I'll see you next week. Be well.